In 1998, the U.S. Air Force fired a missile at one of its own retired fighters and blew it out of the sky. On purpose. A sister jet had survived being struck by lightning 714 times. Decades earlier, one had done something no fighter has ever done again. It flew itself to a perfect, pilotless landing. To understand how something this indestructible ended up destroyed by its own country, we run the story backward. This is the F-106 Delta Dart. Chapter 1. The fighter America used for target practice start at the end. In January 1998, somewhere over a test range, an American missile streaks toward an unmanned aircraft and detonates. The aircraft breaks apart and falls out of the sky. This is not an accident, and it is not an enemy attack. It is a deliberate, sanctioned, entirely intentional act by the United States Air Force, the final flight of the very last Convair F-106 Delta Dart ever to leave the ground, destroyed on purpose, as a target, by the country that built it. For anyone who understands what this aircraft actually was, that fact alone should stop you cold. The F-106 Delta Dart was not some forgettable, second-tier airplane, quietly phased out because it was mediocre. For the better part of 2 decades, it was the single most important line of defense the continental United States possessed against Soviet nuclear bombers. A purpose-built interceptor so fast, so capable, and so central to American strategic doctrine that its entire existence was organized around a single terrifying possibility: intercepting and destroying nuclear-armed aircraft before they could reach American cities. This was, at one point, arguably the most consequential fighter jet in the entire United States arsenal, a machine built, specifically, to stand between an incoming apocalypse and everyone underneath it. And here it is, decades later, being used as an expendable target for other American weapons to practice killing. How does an aircraft go from being the last line of defense against Armageddon to being blown up on purpose by its own country? For practice? The answer is not a simple story of obsolescence. It is a genuinely strange, genuinely remarkable chain of events, one that includes an aircraft that got struck by lightning more times than any jet in history and walked away unscathed. An aircraft that once flew itself to a landing with absolutely nobody at the controls. And an origin story that began with an almost total, humiliating engineering failure. To understand all of it, we have to go backward, piece by piece, from that missile impact in 1998, all the way back to the fear that started this entire program in the first place. The fear of a Soviet bomber nobody could yet stop. Chapter 2. The jet that lightning could not kill. Before we go further back, pause on something almost unbelievable that happened to this same aircraft type in the years just before its retirement. Something that makes the idea of deliberately destroying one feel even stranger in hindsight. Beginning in 1979 and continuing until 1991, NASA's Langley Research Center operated a specially modified F-106B, instrumented with sensors and flown directly into thunderstorms, again and again, for one specific purpose: to study what happens when lightning strikes an aircraft in flight. This was not a theoretical exercise. Researchers needed real data, gathered from a real jet, actually being hit by real lightning, in order to understand how to protect civilian and military aircraft alike from a hazard that had, over the decades, brought down or seriously damaged more aircraft than most people realize. So NASA test pilots did something that sounds almost insane described in isolation. They flew this F-106, deliberately, into the heart of thunderstorms at altitudes ranging from 5,000 feet up to 40,000 feet, at speeds around 300 knots, waiting to get struck. And they got struck. Over the course of the program, this single aircraft was hit by lightning 714 separate times. On one especially intense flight in 1984, at 38,000 feet, the jet was struck 72 times in a single hour. More than one lightning strike per minute, sustained for 60 consecutive minutes. And every single time the aircraft kept flying, no catastrophic damage, no loss of control, no emergency landing, 714 strikes, and the airframe designed in the 1950s to intercept Soviet nuclear bombers simply absorbed every one of them and kept going, giving NASA engineers exactly the kind of real-world data they needed to make lightning protection standards safer for every aircraft that came after it. Think about the contrast this sets up. This is an aircraft type that proved, under genuinely extreme and repeated punishment, to be almost absurdly resilient, struck by nature's own most violent electrical discharge more than 700 times without ever being brought down. And yet, within a decade of that research program ending, examples of the exact same aircraft type were being deliberately shot down by American missiles as target practice. Nature couldn't kill it. Its own country decided to, on purpose, once it no longer had a use for it. To understand why, we need to go back further still, to the years right before the Lightning research began, when the Air Force decided, in bulk, that these aircraft's flying careers as manned interceptors were over. Chapter 3. From Ultimate Defender to Disposable Target Rewind to 1986. By this point, the Delta Dart's operational career as a frontline manned interceptor is winding down, and the Air Force faces the same question every branch of the military eventually faces with retiring hardware. What do you do with dozens of still airworthy, still structurally sound supersonic jets once you no longer need them defending American airspace? The answer in this case is Pacer 6, a program that takes surplus F-106s and converts them into QF-106A target drones, unmanned aircraft designed to be flown by remote control directly into the path of live weapons fire during weapons testing exercises, so that missile systems and other aircraft's weapons can be tested against a genuine, realistic full-scale supersonic jet target rather than a simplified stand-in. 194 surplus aircraft are eventually converted under this program. There is something almost poignant, if you sit with it, about the specific way these conversions worked. The QF-106 drones were not simply gutted, stripped-down husks incapable of real flight. They remained fully capable of being flown by a human pilot when needed, for ferry flights to a test range, for instance, and were only switched into unmanned remotely piloted mode once the actual test began. Which means that, in a very literal sense, these aircraft spent their final years living two different lives simultaneously. Capable, competent flying machines one moment, expendable targets the next, depending entirely on what the mission that day required of them. Picture what that actually looked like on the ground at a base handling these conversions. Rows of F-106s, aircraft that had spent decades on nuclear alert status, engines that had once been scrambled within minutes to intercept an unidentified radar contact approaching the coastline, now sitting wingtip to wingtip, having their cockpits stripped out and replaced with remote control receivers and automated flight control boxes. Technicians who had trained to maintain a frontline interceptor were now, in effect, converting warplanes into remote-controlled targets, aircraft whose entire reason for being modified was to eventually be destroyed by something else's weapon. Some of the pilots who flew Pacer 6 ferry flights described a strange, almost mournful feeling in the cockpit of these jets, knowing that the very aircraft responding smoothly to their control inputs, still fast, still capable, still recognizably a Delta Dart in every way that mattered, was being flown toward a test range specifically so it could be shot down on someone else's data sheet. The program runs for over a decade. Converted aircraft after converted aircraft flown out over test ranges and deliberately destroyed by the very weapon systems the Air Force needed to evaluate. Until finally, in January 1998, the last F-106 ever built, ever flown, ever converted under this program, is destroyed in exactly this way, closing out, for good, the flying history of an aircraft type that had once represented the absolute cutting edge of American air defense technology. But why did the Air Force have so many surplus F-106s to convert into drones in the first place? Why was an aircraft this capable, this famously indestructible under NASA's Lightning tests, taken out of frontline service at all? The answer takes us back another decade, to the 1980s, and to a strategic reality that had shifted so completely underneath this aircraft that its entire original purpose had simply stopped existing. Chapter 4. Obsolete by someone else's progress. Go back to the early to mid-1980s and look at what has changed in the broader landscape of Cold War strategic threats since this aircraft was designed. The F-106 Delta Dart was built, from the very first line drawn on an engineer's desk, to solve one specific problem: intercepting and shooting down Soviet long-range bombers before they could deliver a nuclear weapon to an American target. Everything about the aircraft, its blistering rate of climb, its Mach 2 plus top speed, its specialized armament, its integration into a ground-controlled interception network, existed to serve that single mission. For years, that mission mattered enormously, because manned bombers were genuinely the primary means by which the Soviet Union could deliver a nuclear strike against the continental United States. By the 1980s, that strategic picture has changed almost beyond recognition. The Soviet Union has shifted the overwhelming weight of its nuclear strike capability away from manned bombers and onto intercontinental ballistic missiles. Weapons that travel not at the speeds a fighter jet measures itself against, but at speeds roughly 20 times the speed of sound, arcing through the upper atmosphere and space itself on a trajectory that no manned interceptor, no matter how fast, has any physical hope of catching or stopping. You cannot scramble a fighter jet to intercept an ICBM. The entire premise the F-106 was built around: get airborne fast, climb fast, catch the bomber before it releases its weapon, simply does not apply to a threat that arrives in 30 minutes from across the planet and never enters the atmosphere at an altitude or speed any fighter can reach in time. At the same time, American fighter technology itself has moved on. The introduction of aircraft like the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle offers something the F-106, for all its speed and climb performance, was never really designed to be: a genuinely multi-role air superiority fighter, capable of dogfighting, capable of long-range interception, capable of a flexibility the single-purpose Delta Dart interceptor was never built to match. Against this newer generation of aircraft, and against a strategic threat that has moved fundamentally beyond what any manned interceptor can address, the F-106's specific narrow reason for existing quietly evaporates. There is also a broader institutional shift happening underneath all of this that is worth naming directly: the entire concept of dedicated, single-purpose continental air defense. Squadrons of specialized interceptors sitting on permanent alert at bases scattered across the United States and Canada, ready to scramble against a bomber raid at a moment's notice, gradually loses its central place in American defense planning as the strategic balance of the Cold War shifts toward mutual deterrence, built on missiles, rather than manned aircraft on either side. Budgets that once supported dozens of dedicated interceptor squadrons shrink or get redirected. Bases that once kept F-106s cocked and ready around the clock are drawn down or repurposed. It is not a single decision made in a single afternoon, but a slow accumulating institutional judgment, spread out over years, that the entire mission category the F-106 was purpose-built for no longer justifies the scale of investment it once did. The Air Force does not retire the F-106 because it failed. It retires the F-106 because the entire category of problem it was built to solve, catching a manned bomber before it drops a nuclear weapon, has been almost entirely replaced by a category of problem no fighter jet, however capable, can solve at all. But even before this final strategic obsolescence, there was an earlier moment where the F-106 could have found an entirely different kind of relevance: fighting, not defending, and it never happened. To understand why, we need to go back further still, to the jungles of Vietnam, and to a war this aircraft was seriously considered for, and ultimately never sent to fight. Chapter 5. The war it was built for, but never fought. Rewind to the 1960s, to the height of American involvement in Vietnam, and to a question Air Force planners genuinely wrestled with: should the F-106 Delta Dart, the nation's premier home defense interceptor, be deployed into combat over Southeast Asia. On paper, there was a reasonable case for it. This was, after all, one of the fastest, highest-flying, most capable fighter aircraft in the American inventory. But when planners actually ran comparative evaluations between the F-106 and the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, the aircraft that would go on to become the definitive American fighter of the entire Vietnam War, the F-106 came up short in almost every category that actually mattered for the kind of war being fought in Vietnam. The F-4 Phantom carried a more capable radar system and a significantly larger and more varied weapons load, giving it the flexibility to handle multiple mission types: air-to-air combat, ground attack, reconnaissance variants, all from a single adaptable airframe. The F-106, by contrast, had been built for one job and one job only: high-speed interception of large, non-maneuvering bomber targets approaching in a predictable straight-line profile. And it simply was not equipped, in either sensors or weapons, for the messy, close-in, unpredictable air combat and ground support demands of the actual air war unfolding over Vietnam. The F-106's dedicated air-to-air missile, the AIM-4 Falcon, turned out to be a particularly serious liability in this context. The Falcon had been designed under the assumption that it would be fired at large, steady, high-altitude bomber targets, not at small, agile, aggressively maneuvering fighter aircraft flown by pilots actively trying to defeat it. Over Vietnam, where the F-4 Phantom itself was forced to rely on the Falcon in some early variants, the missile proved to be a significant disappointment compared to the AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles that eventually became the F-4's primary armament, weapons. Genuinely designed and refined, for the kind of dogfighting Vietnam actually demanded. Add to this the simple fact that the F-106 had essentially no meaningful ground attack capability at all, no significant bomb-carrying capacity, no doctrine, no training pipeline built around close air support, and the case for sending America's premier home defense interceptor into a war that primarily needed multi-role fighters and ground attack aircraft essentially falls apart on its own. The F-106 never deploys to Vietnam. It spends the entire war exactly where it had always been stationed, on alert, on American and Allied soil, waiting for a Soviet bomber attack that, as it happens, never comes. There is a particular kind of quiet frustration that comes through in accounts from pilots who flew the Delta Dart during these years, men who had trained for years on one of the fastest, most capable interceptors in the world, who maintained an unglamorous, unbroken rhythm of alert duty, sprinting to their aircraft during practice, scrambles at all hours, sitting cockpit ready through entire shifts, waiting for a klaxon that might mean the beginning of a nuclear war, while their colleagues in F-4 Phantoms flew combat tours over North Vietnam and came home with medals, kill markings, and war stories. The F-106 community's war, if it can even be called that, was fought entirely against uncertainty and boredom punctuated by adrenaline. An entire flying career spent preparing for a battle that both the pilots and the aircraft itself would, in the best possible outcome, never actually have to fight. It is a strange kind of irony when you think about it. An aircraft built to be the ultimate answer to the single most catastrophic threat imaginable, nuclear war, spends its entire operational life never firing a shot in anger, while lesser-known incidents involving the aircraft, incidents that had nothing to do with combat at all, would end up becoming far more famous than anything it ever did on alert duty. And there is no better example of that than the single strangest thing that ever happened to an F-106. An incident so implausible that if it hadn't been extensively documented and photographed, it would sound like an obvious piece of aviation folklore. Chapter 6. The airplane that flew itself go back now to February 2, 1970, to the cold winter skies above Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, where First Lieutenant Gary Faust of the 71st Fighter Interceptor Squadron is flying a routine training sortie, practicing simulated air combat maneuvers against another F-106, exactly the kind of aggressive, high-performance flying this aircraft was built to be capable of. Somewhere in the middle of that training exercise, Faust's aircraft enters a flat spin, one of the most dangerous and difficult to recover from situations a pilot can encounter. A condition in which the aircraft is essentially falling nearly flat, nose only slightly down, rotating around its own vertical axis, with control surfaces largely useless because there simply isn't enough airflow moving properly across them to regain authority over the aircraft. Faust fights it. He tries every recovery technique in the book, deploys the aircraft's drag chute in a last attempt to break the spin and regain control. Nothing works. The aircraft continues falling, spinning, refusing to respond to anything he does. At 15,000 feet, with the ground getting closer and every standard recovery procedure exhausted, Faust makes the only reasonable decision left available to him. He ejects. And then something happens that, by any reasonable expectation of physics and aviation, should not have happened. The moment Faust's ejection seat fires him clear of the aircraft, two things change simultaneously inside that airplane. First, the sudden loss of his body weight shifts the aircraft's center of gravity. Second, and just as important, the explosive downward thrust of the ejection seat firing, combined with the fact that the aircraft's trim had been set for takeoff, nose slightly up, imparts a subtle but crucial nudge to the nose of the airplane at the exact moment its weight distribution changes. Between those two factors, something extraordinary occurs. The aircraft, now with nobody at the controls at all, begins to recover from the flat spin entirely on its own. It does not crash. It does not simply fall out of the sky the way you would expect an unmanned, uncontrolled fighter jet in a spin to fall. It settles into a slow, gentle, remarkably stable descending glide, engine still idling away, exactly as it had been left, and begins gradually losing altitude in a controlled, almost graceful manner completely unlike the violent spin it had just escaped from. Witnesses on the ground that day describe an almost surreal scene, a sleek, swept, unmistakably military jet descending calmly out of a gray Montana winter sky with no apparent trouble at all. Engine note steady, nose gently up, looking for all the world like a perfectly ordinary, perfectly competent landing approach, except that anyone who looked closely enough to see into the cockpit would have found it completely, unnervingly empty. Local residents who caught sight of the aircraft in its final descent had no way of knowing they were watching something that should not, by any reasonable understanding of aerodynamics and control, have been possible at all. Down below, in the snow-covered farmland near the small town of Big Sandy, Montana, this empty, pilotless supersonic interceptor descends out of the winter sky and, astonishingly, brings itself in for what amounts to a genuine belly landing, skidding across the surface of a snow-covered field on its own metal undercarriage, engine still idling, slowly grinding to a stop with nobody aboard to guide a single moment of it. The damage, when investigators finally reach the aircraft, is remarkably minor. One officer examining the scene would later remark, with a mixture of astonishment and dark humor, that if the aircraft had suffered just slightly less damage in the landing, it could very nearly have been flown right back out of the field under its own power. As it stands, the airframe is judged repairable, and it is in fact recovered, restored, and returned to full operational service, eventually flying again with the 49th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. Meanwhile, Gary Faust, the pilot who had ejected because he believed entirely reasonably that his aircraft was moments from crashing and killing him, parachutes safely to the ground and survives the entire ordeal essentially unhurt, only to eventually learn that the airplane he'd just abandoned had, in his absence, calmly flown itself to a landing far gentler than almost any recovery he could plausibly have executed by staying inside it. The story does not end there. In one of the more remarkable footnotes in aviation history, Gary Faust himself gets to fly that exact same aircraft again nearly a decade later, in 1979, while training at Tyndall Air Force Base, reunited, by pure administrative coincidence, with the very airplane that had once flown a landing without him. And when the F-106 fleet is eventually retired, this specific aircraft, now permanently nicknamed the Cornfield Bomber by the press and by history, despite having actually landed in a snow-covered wheat field rather than a cornfield, is preserved rather than scrapped or converted into a target drone, going on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in August 1986. The exact same year the Pacer 6 drone conversion program began turning its surviving sister aircraft into targets for other weapons to destroy. Sit with that detail for a moment, because it is a genuinely striking coincidence buried inside this story. 1986 is the year the Air Force begins converting F-106s into disposable target drones to be shot down on purpose, and it is also the exact year the one F-106 that had already proven itself capable of surviving on its own, of landing itself, of essentially refusing to die even when its own pilot had already given up on it, gets pulled out of that fate entirely and preserved forever in a museum instead. The airplane that had already demonstrated it deserved to survive is the one airplane that actually did. But none of what made that miracle landing physically possible, the aircraft's low-speed stability, its remarkably forgiving handling characteristics even in extremis, happened by accident. It was engineered into the aircraft deliberately as the direct result of fixing a catastrophic failure in the design that came before it. To understand that, we need to go back one more decade, to the aircraft's earliest origins, and to a predecessor that very nearly embarrassed the entire program before it even got off the ground. Chapter 7. Weapons Built for a War That Never Came. Before we go all the way back to the beginning, it's worth pausing on exactly what this aircraft was built to carry, because the armament tells you everything about what kind of war its designers were actually preparing to fight. Unlike almost every other fighter aircraft of its era, the F-106 was never meant to carry conventional bombs at all. Its entire weapons bay was built around a single mission: destroying enemy bombers at a distance. Before they could release their payload, standard armament included up to 4 Hughes AIM-4 Falcon missiles, some variants using infrared guidance, others semi-active radar homing, tucked into an internal weapons bay to preserve the aircraft's clean supersonic aerodynamics. But the weapon that truly defined the F-106's purpose, the one that reveals just how seriously American war planners took the possibility of a mass Soviet bomber raid, was the Air-2 Genie, an unguided air-to-air rocket carrying a 1.5 kiloton nuclear warhead, designed to be fired directly into the heart of an enemy bomber formation and detonated in the air, with a lethal radius large enough to guarantee the destruction of every aircraft in that formation in a single strike, without ever needing precision guidance at all. Read that again. American interceptor pilots, flying missions over or near American and Canadian soil, were equipped with a genuine, live nuclear weapon, meant to be detonated in friendly airspace in the event of a full-scale Soviet bomber raid. An almost unthinkable proposition today, but a perfectly rational one within the strategic logic of the era, when the alternative being weighed was the guaranteed detonation of nuclear weapons over American cities, if even a handful of bombers got through unintercepted. It would not be until 1972, under a modification program called Project 6 Shooter, that the F-106 finally receives something closer to a conventional weapon. A new bubble canopy, without the metal bracing that had previously restricted pilot visibility, and space for an M61 Vulcan 20mm rotary cannon carrying 650 rounds of ammunition, installed in place of the Genie rocket. It is, in a sense, a quiet acknowledgement that the aircraft might need a way to fight an enemy at closer range than a nuclear-tipped rocket was ever meant to be used for. A small but telling shift in how the Air Force was beginning to think about the aircraft's role, even as its original nuclear intercept mission remained its primary reason for existing. All of this, the missiles, the nuclear rocket, the eventual cannon, depended on one more piece of technology that made the F-106 genuinely revolutionary for its era. And understanding it requires going back to the very beginning of the aircraft's design. Chapter 8. The ground controlled the sky, go back to the aircraft's original design and its integration with one of the most ambitious computerized defense networks ever built for its time. The semi-automatic ground environment system, known as SAGE, the F-106, was equipped with the Hughes MA-1 integrated fire control system, a piece of technology that, when it worked as intended, allowed ground-based radar controllers, feeding data through the SAGE network's room-sized computers, to essentially fly the interceptor for the pilot during the critical intercept phase of a mission. A controller on the ground, watching an incoming bomber formation on radar, could feed steering commands directly into the F-106's autopilot, guiding the aircraft automatically toward an optimal firing position, with the pilot largely monitoring the aircraft rather than actively flying it, right up until the moment of weapons release. It was, for the late 1950s and early 1960s, a genuinely futuristic concept: half-manned, half-automated air defense, computers on the ground reaching out and taking partial control of a fighter jet in the sky, years before anyone was using the term networked warfare. The system was also, by most honest accounts, deeply and persistently troublesome. The MA-1 fire control system earned a reputation among maintenance crews and pilots alike as temperamental and unreliable, requiring more than 60 separate upgrade programs over the course of its operational life just to keep it functioning at an acceptable standard. It was ambitious, genuinely ahead of its time in concept, and often frustratingly unreliable in practice, a combination that, in its own way, mirrors the entire trajectory of the aircraft it was built into: extraordinary potential, married to a level of complexity that never quite stopped causing problems. None of this technology, the automated ground-directed interception, the nuclear rocket, the very airframe capable of surviving a flat spin and landing itself in a snow-covered field, would have existed at all if not for the program's rocky, humiliating start. To understand that, we finally arrive at the true beginning of this story. Chapter 9. Born from an embarrassing failure, go back to the early 1950s, to a Convair-built aircraft called the F-102 Delta Dart, the airplane that was originally supposed to become America's supersonic interceptor, and that very nearly failed before it ever entered service at all. Early prototypes of the F-102 were, to put it plainly, a disappointment. Despite an aggressive delta wing design and a powerful engine, the aircraft could not reliably exceed the speed of sound in level flight, a fundamental, embarrassing shortfall for an aircraft explicitly designed to be a supersonic interceptor. The problem, it turned out, was aerodynamic. The way the fuselage's cross-sectional area changed along its length was creating far more transonic drag than engineers had anticipated, a problem that threatened to derail the entire program. The fix came from an aerodynamicist named Richard Whitcomb and a principle that became known as the area rule: the insight that an aircraft's total cross-sectional area, measured along its entire length, including the wings, needs to increase and decrease smoothly, without abrupt changes, in order to minimize transonic drag. Applying this principle meant reshaping the F-102's fuselage into the distinctive pinched wasp waist shape that would go on to become a hallmark of supersonic aircraft design for years afterward. With that fix, along with an upgraded engine, the redesigned F-102A finally achieved genuine supersonic performance. But the Air Force, having watched the program stumble so badly the first time around, wanted something more than a patched-up fix. Starting in December 1951, even as the F-102A was still working its way toward operational service, planning was already underway for a far more thorough, ground-up redesign, initially designated the F-102B. That redesign eventually becomes so extensive, incorporating a new, more powerful Pratt & Whitney J75 engine, revised aerodynamics, and dramatically improved systems, that in June 1956 the Air Force gives it an entirely new designation, acknowledging that this is no longer really a variant of the troubled F-102 at all, but essentially a new aircraft built on the lessons of its predecessor's failure. It becomes the F-106A Delta Dart, And it is, in almost every meaningful respect, the airplane the F-102 was always supposed to be. Capable of Mach 2. 3. Able to climb to 57,000 feet at a staggering rate of nearly 29,000 feet per minute. Powerful enough and stable enough to eventually survive flat spins, lightning strikes, and every other extreme condition that would be thrown at it over the following 4 decades. It is worth sitting for a moment with the fact that the aircraft that would go on to become one of the most resilient, most quietly remarkable fighter jets in American history very nearly did not happen at all, that it exists specifically because an earlier design failed badly enough, and embarrassingly enough, that the Air Force insisted on starting over rather than settling for a patched-together compromise. But why did any of this need to happen in the first place? Why was the United States pouring this level of engineering effort, expense, and institutional will into building the fastest possible interceptor in the world? For that, we need to go back one final step to the specific fear that started the entire program before a single line had ever been drawn. Chapter 10. The bomber that started everything. Go back, finally, to the years immediately following the Second World War, when the United States finds itself confronting an entirely new category of existential threat: the possibility of a nuclear-armed Soviet Union delivering an atomic weapon directly onto American soil, using long-range strategic bombers capable of striking targets thousands of miles from Soviet territory. The aircraft that crystallizes this fear most vividly is the Tupolev Tu-95, a large, 4-engine, propeller-driven Soviet strategic bomber capable of flying thousands of miles without refueling, carrying a nuclear payload directly toward the heart of the North American continent. Unlike a fast jet bomber that might be detected and intercepted relatively close to its target, the Tu-95's sheer range means it could, in theory, be launched from deep within Soviet territory and still reach virtually any major American city. A genuinely continent-spanning threat that American air defense planners in the early 1950s have almost no reliable way to counter. This fear becomes the driving force behind the United States Air Force's 1954 Interceptor program, a formal, urgent effort to develop and field an aircraft specifically capable of detecting, intercepting, and destroying Soviet bombers before they could release their weapons anywhere near American soil. It is, in the truest sense, a race against an imagined countdown clock. Every year without an adequate interceptor is another year in which a Soviet bomber raid could, at least theoretically, succeed in delivering a devastating nuclear strike against the American homeland. Convair's proposal for this program is the F-102, the aircraft that will go on to fail its early performance targets, force an emergency aerodynamic redesign under the area rule, and eventually evolve, through years of additional engineering effort and an almost complete ground-up rebuild, into the F-106 Delta Dart. Every single thing that follows from this point forward: the Mach 2 speed, the 57,000-foot ceiling, the nuclear rocket, the ground-controlled SAGE intercept system, the aircraft's eventual near-total absence from Vietnam, the miracle landing near Big Sandy, Montana, the 714 lightning strikes, and finally, the deliberate destruction of the last surviving airframe by its own country's missiles in 1998, traces directly back to a single, specific fear: a slow, long-range Soviet bomber that American radar might spot too late, and that only the fastest possible interceptor could hope to stop in time. Epilogue. Reading it forward, now that we've walked this entire story backward, from a missile deliberately destroying the last F-106 in 1998, through more than 700 lightning strikes it once shrugged off, through a decade spent as a target drone, through obsolescence at the hands of intercontinental missiles and newer fighters, through a war in Vietnam it was specifically evaluated for, and specifically passed over, through the single most improbable pilotless landing in aviation history, through a nuclear rocket built for a war that, thankfully, never came, through a ground-controlled interception system, decades ahead of its time, all the way back to an embarrassing aerodynamic failure that forced its complete redesign, and further still to the specific fear of a single Soviet bomber. It's worth turning around and looking at the whole shape of it the way these decades actually unfolded. A supersonic interceptor is born out of failure, redesigned from the ground up specifically to counter a slow, long-range Soviet bomber that American planners feared more than almost any other single weapon of the early Cold War. It becomes so fast, so capable of climbing, and so tightly integrated with a computerized, ground-controlled defense network that a human pilot can at times become almost a passenger during the most critical phase of its own mission. It carries for years an actual nuclear weapon as its primary armament, built for a mass bomber raid that, as it turns out, never comes, because deterrence, however uneasy, however genuinely terrifying in retrospect, holds. It gets seriously considered for the air war over Vietnam, and gets passed over, because it was built too narrowly, too specifically for exactly one job, and that job wasn't the one Vietnam required. It survives a flat spin over Montana that should have destroyed it, and instead lands itself, gently, in a snow-covered field, with nobody aboard, becoming one of the strangest and most enduring legends in the entire history of American military aviation. It gets struck by lightning more than 700 times in the name of scientific research, and never once goes down. And then, once the strategic threat it was built to counter shifts permanently into a realm no manned fighter can reach, it gets quietly retired, converted in bulk into target drones, and, one by one, deliberately shot down by the very country that had once trusted it to be the last line of defense against nuclear annihilation. That is the real story of the F-106 Delta Dart, not simply a fast jet from the Cold War, but a machine that proved, again and again, in ways nobody could have planned for, that it was tougher, more forgiving, and more resilient than almost anything asked of it, and that ultimately met its end not because it failed, but because the world it had been built to defend against had, for better or worse, moved on without it. Somewhere in a museum in Ohio, one single example of this aircraft still sits on display, the very same airframe that once flew itself to a landing with nobody inside it. The one F-106, out of hundreds that the future could not bring itself to destroy.